You've heard of the horse whisperer, the guy who has the innate ability to understand and interpret horses. Well, just outside Atlanta, Georgia, there's a guy some people call the movie whisperer. His name is Bryan Coley, and he has the innate ability to understand and interpret people through their favorite movies. An NYU film grad and a former editor at Turner Broadcasting, today Coley runs a company called Reel, where he movie whispers on a small scale by showing people what their top 10 favorite movies say about their personal story. But his biggest revelation came 8 years ago when he started looking at the yearly slate of Best Picture nominees at the Academy Awards to see whether there were any common themes shared between the films.
And so about 7 years ago, I started diving into the Oscars.
Because I believe that the Oscars are prophetic and that our artists are our prophets to our generation.
The Oscar nominees give us a picture of where our narrative is headed.
How the Oscars have been kind of foreshadowing our story as a country.
So if you look at what we do at Real Experiences, where we take a person's top 10 movies, and it forms this palette that we can look at certain threads and themes, and ultimately it brings out insights for a person's story. Well, I thought, why not try that with the Oscar films, like the nominees? They form a palette of films. And what I found is as soon as I started looking for threads and themes and insights, it was just like they were pouring out. And then what was crazy is that those insights and themes actually played out in culture over the course of the next year.
In other words, Bryan Coley believes that the annual Oscar nominees actually foreshadow major cultural events in America before they happen. Since 2014, Coley has been revealing Oscar themes that have foreshadowed our story as a nation. But it was this most recent year's movie whispering that finally got my attention. As the pandemic tested our devotion to one another at every turn in 2020, the call to be our brother's keeper was only amplified through racial justice protests after the death of George Floyd, the debate over mask wearing, misinformation in the election, and the Capitol siege. And as you may have guessed, Coley believes the Oscar nominees foreshadowed it all back when they were announced in January of 2020. This is footage of Bryan Coley on Oscar Sunday in February 2020, before the pandemic was a blip on America's radar.
To remain a we, it seems like these movies are telling us that in the midst of an escalating war and battles, for the sake of our children, we have to test our devotions to determine if we will be our brothers and sisters' keeper. I don't know. I just feel like there's probably something that might happen this year that tests this idea, I don't know what it could be. I don't know how it could play out even beyond the election.
So if Coley is right, who is the grand mastermind behind these movies coming together to speak into our story? Is it the directors? Is it the studios? Is it the members of the entire Academy? Bryan Coley believes it's
God. I think God is a God of motion pictures. It's his language. And I think he loves using artists. I think he loves using Hollywood to tell his story.
Well, hello. Thank you guys for being here today. It's so meaningful that you came all this way to come for the 10th annual God and the Oscars event. It wasn't originally called God and the Oscars. Originally, you called it the Oscar Salon, which I always thought was kind of a weird title. It was like salon, like a hairdresser or something, but it's like a thing that old people would do in the 1800s, and it was like a TED Talk back then.
TED Talk back then, yes.
But you had to explain it every time.
You had to explain it every time.
Now you can just say God and the Oscars, and there's some questions there too, but it's at least a little bit more clear.
Why don't you introduce yourself, by the way?
Yes, I am Houston Coley. I am a documentary filmmaker. I'm the creative director of Art Within, and I am also, a YouTuber and film critic, and your son, the movie whisperer's son.
Son of movie whisperer. I like it. I'm Bryan Coley, and I don't think I want to call myself the movie whisperer, and that kind of goes into why I changed it from Oscar Salon to God and the Oscar, was because I really felt like really it's God who's doing the movie whispering, and I'm just kind of listening to what he's saying about these movies and kind of interpreting, and then being able to just share what I feel like he's saying about these movies. I'm not quite sure, but I just feel really deeply that these Oscars are a part of him revealing his story to us through the culture.
So I think we want to get to this concept of God and the Oscars, but before we even do that, I went and interviewed some people throughout 2021 who were able to go and talk about the idea of God and art. And there were a bunch of brilliant people, prophetic people, Christian speakers and non-Christian speakers, and a bunch of people from across the spectrum talking about this idea of God working through art. And so we thought we would show some of those interviews, or at least some pieces of them, to give you a little bit of taste of that concept before we get into the Oscars.
Sounds good.
It's interesting to think about how the world would be different if we all kind of watched movies from the perspective that God might have something to say to us.
God will speak however he wants to speak and through whatever means he wants to speak. But I do believe that I think God speaks more loudly through secular films.
I absolutely believe that God can use all art, including from those who have no interest.
That's the beauty of God's grace, is that by God's wisdom, God doesn't limit grace, right, to people who recognize grace.
In acts of creating, we are reflecting the fact that we are created and that we were born to create.
You can say, well, does he come in and specifically inspired this? I don't know, but I think he set the things in motion that lead to great creativity.
When you participate in art and in film, this is a part of creation. And how can you not speak? Why would you have a theology that believes that there's an area of the universe that God is not present in?
I wouldn't dismiss this, because as we talked about the timing of some of these films and where they land and how they land and how it's kind of inexplicable and strange and mysterious. I mean, those are all adjectives I would apply to God.
If these films are telling us something true about ourselves, about our world, about our place in it, then we have to admit that that is in some way divine.
It's giving us insight into understanding maybe what our role needs to be during this time. That we can be the change makers, but maybe it starts with us, and that the importance isn't necessarily that the world catches these themes. Maybe it's that the Christian community catches these themes and recognizes what the world's hunger is, and also can connect that to maybe what God's hunger is, that this might be what God wants for the world.
So we've talked about God speaking through art, but I think you take it a little bit of a step further and say, okay, he's speaking through not just art, but the Oscars specifically. Right. So I wanted to give you a chance to do the usual disclaimers that you always do to make sure people don't get the wrong idea.
Yeah, usually I do these disclaimers, and today I thought I'd test my son out a little bit, because he's heard these disclaimers like all his life practically. And so I wanted to see if he can actually do the disclaimers for me. So Chris, if you can bring up, yeah, there you go. So
okay, I haven't seen these.
Yeah, I kind of made it a little bit mysterious as to what I was trying to say. So the first premise, when you think about God and Oscar, one of the first disclaimers I have is not a fan of parties. So, well, what do you think that means?
I would assume that that means the thing that you often say, which is that you're not really talking about God speaking through like the party of the Oscars, right, or the ceremony, the fancy dresses and the patting each other on the back.
Or slapping each other on the face, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But it's more about the films themselves that God is speaking through. And the party is just a way to gather those films into some sort of way to elevate them in their voice.
That's exactly right. All right, you got number one. Number two?
Don't show me the money. Okay, let me think about it. I would assume that this might mean the thing about the fact that most Oscar movies don't make much money.
That's correct. Yeah, so usually movies who are up for Oscars, they're usually passion projects. So you have some artist who really wants to make a film, a filmmaker, or maybe it's an actor, and so they come together to make this film because they want to say something. So it's less about commerce, and anytime you take commerce out of the equation, usually you are doing art for art's sake, and when that happens, usually art for art's sake usually has much more meaning, and unfortunately nobody goes and sees these films. But we had a couple of movies this year that
Top Gun and Avatar made a bunch of money.
Yeah, and you were the one who actually pointed out that it was still passion projects. So it was Tom Cruise's passion project and James
Cameron's passion project.
So there's a little bit of, that's the flavor of the Oscars, is that you're watching things that have meaning. So one of the things that frustrates me is that all we do is talk about a party and slap each other on the back and all this kind of stuff. But in reality, why aren't we looking at the meaning behind these movies when they're made in such a way that people made them for that very purpose? So that is one of the reasons I think that the Oscars are important, but also that God is speaking through them, because it's almost like the artists are prophets, if that makes sense. All right, next one up.
Supernatural timing. Okay, I would think that this has something to do with the fact that all these movies are made at different times, greenlit at different times,
That's right.
and take many, many years to be made, but then they all coalesce into this one year, where often there's sort of a consistent theme between them, even though they were all made in separate years. I mean, even in like 2021, after the pandemic, there were all these films that had been delayed multiple years because of the pandemic, and yet they still came together in common themes, which was fascinating.
That's exactly right. So, you know, I made a movie and it took me 8 years to make my movie, right? And so
Avatar 2 took 13 years?
13 years, Avatar 2. So the conceptions of movies are way, way back here in history. Then they make them, then they distribute them, and then they're hopefully nominated for an Oscar. And so the fact that this palette, I call it a palette of parables, that all of a sudden this palette of parables comes together in such a way that if you look at the common themes, that's what I feel like where God is in it all, is that it's just supernatural that these films come together at this specific time. And we'll give you some examples of that in just a second. So, all right, next up, or the last one. Yeah.
You're speaking my language. I don't know what you mean by this one.
Oh, well, to me, this is like foundational. Like, I don't know if you might be feeling like, okay, theologically, Bryan, like where do you stand on like God and Oscars and stuff like that? And for me, I've always believed that God is a God of motion pictures. He loves imagery, he loves metaphor. And so if you think of the Old Testament prophets, their lives, their stories were actually metaphor and imagery for what would be Jesus. And then if you look at Jesus's life, he came to show us the Father, and so he was a motion picture of God. And then, of course, he talked in parables, which were motion pictures. They weren't just, stories, or they were images, like you remember his stories by the motion pictures playing in your head. And then, of course, I think our lives are supposed to be, motion pictures for, showing people God, So to me, I just believe this is his language. And why would he not use people who speak his language really well? So if you spoke Spanish and someone was speaking Spanish in a way that really was impactful, then then wouldn't you listen if that was the language God spoke, if that makes sense?
So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the idea of foreshadowing and what we've seen in previous years with the Oscars, because I've sort of followed this as you've done it over the years, and it's often culminated in ways that we've been surprised by and you've been surprised by as the year played out after that. The initial Oscar party and all that kind of stuff.
That's exactly right. So when I got into this, and I think I said it in the video, was all of a sudden I was just kind of looking at the meaning behind the movies, and then suddenly I was seeing these themes playing out in culture over the next year. And just for the first 3 years, it was just amazing how they... So here's a slide of all the movies. So this is, believe it or not, 2023 is not on there. And that represents the 10 years. So these are 9 years, and the lines are the elections. Probably, I'll just give you a few years where it was just like, oh my gosh, like only God could have done that. So in 2017, which was the year right after the election, the question that all of these movies were asking were, will we be a we? So if you think about it, we just came through an election that just polarized us, right? And so we were divided as a country, and then all of a sudden these movies all came together and asked the same dramatic question, which is, will we be a we?
And I think something you might want to note is the fact that, at least starting in 2014, you started to view this set of films as the main character of these films is America.
That's a good point, yeah. So I started looking at, what if America was the main character? And so, asking that question, well, what are these films asking as far as that's concerned? And a lot of them were, will we be a we? And the answer for that was that we needed to revisit the past and get a proper narrative of the past. So, you probably, I know this year really impacted you.
This is probably my favorite year, I think. Yeah, I mean, I've had years where I liked all the movies better, but this was a year where the theme really coalesced in an interesting way.
Yeah, so you got movies like that are, everybody probably has seen Hidden Figures by this point, where you literally are going back in time and getting another narrative that we missed and getting the proper narrative of the past. And then you have like movies like Lion and Moonlight and Manchester by the Sea. These are all movies where you're going back and looking at the sins of the past or the stories of the past and trying to get that proper narrative. Well, so that was, what I shared in 2017. Well, the cultural events that happened in 2017 were Charlottesville, where suddenly we were going back and looking at, the narrative of our past through these statues and kind of revisiting the sins of our past as a country. And then there was the NFL kneel down, which was a part of just like, athletes saying, hey, I want my narrative to be a part of this narrative. And then, as far as looking at the sins of the past, all of a sudden in October of that year, the Me Too movement happened, in which all these people were outed for, these sins of the past that were happening, and they came to the surface. So it was a year that was just like, oh my goodness, just undeniable how the movies were speaking into culture. 2020, you shared, that was a year, based on your voiceover that you say in your voiceover that kind of was a tipping point for you believing in all this.
Well, I had been in England when you did your Oscar party that year, and I think that was the biggest year you'd done too. It was down at the area over there, and huge
here
party.
At Pinewood, when it was formerly Pinewood Studios.
And so I had been gone. I remember Parasite winning Best Picture. I was so excited about that. And then I came home and I was in quarantine because of the pandemic. And that was when I went back and rewatched his whole speech and all the stuff that you had said during the Oscar party that year. And I was like, this is incredibly prophetic towards what we are, what's going on with the pandemic right now. And you had given that in early February, before the pandemic was a blip on anybody's radar. And I think the clip got muted there for a minute when you were talking, but you were saying, all of these films are saying we have to test our devotions in the midst of war and battles and uncertainty to see if we will be our brother or sister's keeper.
That's right.
And then I came back and we were in quarantine and we were trying to figure out how do we be our brother's keeper in all of this.
We were checking money and people, so we had to test our devotion between money or business and people, and we chose people. And then we were testing our, George Floyd happened that summer, so we were testing our devotion to our brother and sisters of color. And then I knew the election was going to be at least playing into this, but I did not know January 6th would be like craziness as far as us going, are we going to stay together and be a we, and can we test our devotion?
Well, and it was an example of intense devotion to something.
Right, exactly. So it kind of played out in spades in 2020. And I want to kind of put a footnote right now because I think this is really important. This is not about fortune telling or tarot card reading or anything like that. To me, this is about God loving us enough to go, hey, this is kind of the water you're going to swim in, and I want to prepare you for that water you're going to swim in. So for me in 2020, I kind of let the Oscar theme lead my life that year. So I went, okay, I'm going to wear this mask because probably I wouldn't. I've been really resistant to wear a mask. But the reason I wore the mask was because I was like, okay, these Oscars have said we got to test our devotion to see if we'll be our brother and sister's keeper. And so I'm going to do that to love my neighbor. And so the Oscars were like God helping me stay focused on what his narrative was and what was going on. Now, again, don't hear that I'm saying that God caused the pandemic, but that this is the water we were swimming in, and God kind of gives us that water to tell us this is what you're going to be swimming in the next year.
Kind of wrestle with those themes before they even play out.
Exactly. Yeah. And so last year was another one of those years that was crazy. So I had done all of my research and kind of looked at all the movies, and I came up with this theme, which is about territorialism. And so the question was, is there a place for us, which is kind of a little riff on West Side Story of, there's a place for us. Is there a place for us? And everything was about these lines, like people were marking territory. You had Dune, in which you had this invading force that was coming and taking over this territory. Obviously people have seen West Side Story and the Sharks and Jets fighting over territory. And so it was if we were going to be a we had to stop marking our territory. And then there was another thing about Gen Z being change agents. Well, think about what happened. Right when I was doing the Oscars last year, Russia invades the Ukraine and actually, takes over their territory, or, so the whole territorialism actually played out while the Oscars were happening last year. So it was just absolutely amazing. And, And then I still don't know this yet, but I've been looking for Gen Z. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but I've been looking for Gen Z to be these change agents. And closest I have so far is the Asbury Revival, but if you've heard of that. But we'll talk about that in a little bit, just kind of reviewing.
A little fun thing was that after that big revelation with Ukraine and stuff had happened, we were rewatching Dune.
That's right.
With the subtitles on, and we realized that the big villain's name is Vladimir.
Just incredible, right? And we wouldn't have known that unless we had the subtitles on, because nobody calls him that in the movie.
Yeah.
But then we had the subtitles on, and literally the invading force, leader was named Vladimir. It was just insane. So.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about this year's Oscar
nominees? Let's look at this year's Oscars. So this is the nominees for Best Picture 2023. We're going to actually do a little audience interaction here. So, most people don't go see the Oscar movies. So we're going to see how many folks here actually have seen any of these movies, all right? Now, what we're going to do is Houston and I are going to pick the movies that we think you've probably seen and which one we think you've probably seen most. So I'm going Top Gun on this one. You're going what?
I think I got to say Avatar. It technically outgrossed Top Gun, so.
All right, let's do it. So, show of hands, how many of you guys went and saw Top Gun?
Whoa.
Boom, baby.
All right, I'm scared.
Yes, you should be scared. All right, how many of you guys went and saw Avatar? All right, I won. Yes,
man.
That's what I thought. Tom Cruise wins the day every time, especially there's a lot of ladies in the room. So anyway, all right, so now we're going to do the bottom two. All right, so I'm going to pick one that I think nobody has seen. I'm going to pick, let me do Triangle of Sadness. And what are you going to pick?
I got to say, it's a great movie, but Women Talking.
Yeah, Women Talking is a good movie. You should see it. But I agree, probably people haven't. So, all right, show of hands, how many people have seen Triangle of Sadness? We got 3. All right, and how many people have seen Women Talking? We got 2. I win again. Nicely done. All right, and then there's kind of movies in the middle. So you have a favorite. We have a favorite that we want to win the Oscar, but it probably won't. The one we pick never does. But it's the one we liked the most last year, and that is The Banshees of Inisherin. How many of you guys have seen that?
Okay,
a little bit more, yeah. All right.
You should see it. It's the best.
It is the best. And then the one that we think is going to win tonight, that's going to sweep the Oscars, is Everything Everywhere All at Once. How many of you guys have seen that? All right, a little bit more. Yeah, that's good. All right, very cool. All right, so that's a little bit of the Oscars this year and trying to figure out what is it that the Oscars are saying. So I want to kind of give you a slide. This is kind of what it looks like when I break down the Oscars. I give these themes, so this is just here. In fact, I should title this slide Everything Everywhere All at Once because it is just a lot to look at. Each of the themes are a separate bubble, as well as what you see in the parentheses is how many movies that it shows up in. So you can see the biggest one is relational barriers and boundaries, which we'll get to. So this is just a picture. We're going to come back, look at this picture a little bit more a little bit later. So that's the first thing to show you. As far as the question again this year, the question that we're fighting over again is, can we be a we? So once again, you have all these movies where people are trying to be a we, and so that is still the question. This question of we kind of changes all the time. So there is like, will we remain a we has been one year. Is there a place for us is last year. There is, will we be a we? This year is sort of like, can we even do it? Like, is it even possible for us as a country to come together and be a we? And so that is the question for this year as far as what we're looking at. The first actual theme that I want to kind of look at, which might make us feel like we're not going to be able to be a we, is the first theme is what we call InterTribal family fighting. So that doesn't speak well at all, right? So 9 of the movies actually have families fighting or tribal, kind of intertribal fighting. Now this is really important because last year it was very external fighting. Like, in Dune, it's like 2 warring armies. It's like 2 gangs fighting each other. This year it's like the Fablemans and they're fighting amongst each other in their family. Or, 2 guys on an island with banshees, and even Avatar where you have, some sort of tribal fighting. Really it's about the family and what happens in the family. So that is, what's going on. Let me show you what it looks like in the movies, although we have to disclaim it first.
I have to explain a word.
We got to explain a word. You want to go ahead and explain it?
We're using a clip to establish this from The Banshees of Inisherin, which is an Irish movie. And so throughout the movie, she often says, his sister in the movie often says, "Are you rowing?" Which means, are you arguing? Are you fighting?
Are you fighting? Yeah, so when you hear in the clip them saying rowing, it means fighting. So here we go. Here's what it looks like.
Have you been rowing?
We haven't been rowing.
I want to stay and fight.
I want to stay and fight too. No one's surprised that you do. All you do is fight.
You are fired. You are fired. You're fired.
Have we been rowing?
My scar! Understand my point. I'm your mother. I wish you weren't. I saved your life. I saved your life.
Sounds like you've been rowing. It does sound like we've been rowing.
Yeah, rowing.
It does look like we're rowing.
I think they're rowing.
I think they're rowing.
They're rowing. I can't get the Irish accent, but so that's kind of a picture. If as you can see, it's a whole lot of fighting amongst each other, which doesn't really bode well as far as like if we're looking at a thematic. Right now it's saying, can we be a we? And then it's like, well, here's all this people fighting, which kind of is very reflective of, what we've been through.
And you've put dots on 9 of the movies. I would argue it's 10, because even in All Quiet on the Western Front, it's a war between Europe, which
That's
is sort
true.
of
Look
kin.
at my son movie whispering here. I love this. All right, it's good. So there is the question of how these movies answer, can we be a we? So what you see here on this slide is the ones that are green, those are the ones that say, yes, we can be a we. They're kind of redemptive tales where the we does happen. The ones that are in red, are no, they can't be a we. The ones that are in blue are like, sort of maybe, I'm not sure. So like, for instance, women talking, you have the women who actually leave the colony and leave the men, spoiler alert. And so they are a we, the women are, but they're no longer a we as far as the colony is concerned. Or if you look at the Fabelmans, yeah, they're a we, but they're kind of, there's people have left the family and things like that. There's sort of a we. So it brings in this question of, like what I call the center of good. It's another theme that comes into the movies, and that is that it's sort of complicated. Like 8 of the movies, the idea of what is good is kind of complicated, or what is nice is kind of complicated. You know what I mean by center of good, right? You want to tell them what that means as far as screenwriting?
Yeah, the center of good is a screenwriting term. It just means the thing that the audience is rooting for. So in a superhero movie, the center of good is them defeating the bad guy. But in a romance movie, the center of good would usually be, well, we want them to get together.
Right.
But some movies, like a lot of the movies during this Oscar season, have sort of a complex center of good where it's like, I kind of see both sides here, and I don't know what I really want for them.
Right, exactly. So we wanted to show a clip of what that looks like from Banshees of Inisherin, because that movie, if anything, was one of those movies where you went in the first time and you were like, oh, poor Colin Farrell's character, this is what happens to him. And then you come back and watch it the second time and you're like, I don't know, maybe he was, no, I don't think so. And then you kind of are rooting for the other character. And then you watch it the third time and you're like, I can't even, I need to talk to somebody about this. I don't know if you've ever been in a movie where you're like, I got to talk to somebody about this movie. Usually what's happening when that happens is the center of good is not clear. It makes us talk about things, right? It makes us have conversations because that center of good is just not a good or bad, evil or good. It's like, well, I can't find the good in this, right? And so we're going to show you a clip that is Colin Farrell's character is named Porrick. Porrick? Yeah.
Porrick?
Porrick. It's hard to say.
You gotta get the accent in there.
Porrick. And then Brendan Gleeson's character is Colm. And Colm has basically told Porrick, hey, I don't want to, like, we're breaking up. I don't want to talk to you anymore. And so this is a scene of, you can see the tension between the two characters and the lack of center of good.
Why can't you just leave me alone, Barry? Huh? I've already told you, haven't I?
Yeah, I know, I was just...
I mean, why can't you just leave me alone? What are you doing?
I don't know.
For fuck's sake, like.
How's the new tune?
What?
So you can see in the clip, and if you watch the movie, it'll make a lot more sense. These are two guys who have kind of broken up, and and when you watch it, you feel sorry for Colin Farrell's character. You're like, oh, bless his heart. But then you also are like, Brendan Gleeson's character. You're like, well, he just will not respect the fact that he does not want to be friends anymore. And so you're sitting there really trying to figure out what the center of good is. And I feel like when we look at our nation, and when we look at the concept of can we be a we, now we've got that we're fighting, and then it's like we can't figure out who's right or wrong. We can't figure out who's good and who's bad. We have a lack of sense of center of good. And let me make matters even worse with one more theme, which is the theme of staying or going. And there's a lot of breakups or attempted breakups in these movies. Like, people are leaving right and left. And so I'll show you this one. Here's what that looks like in the movies.
Stay and fight? Leave. I'm leaving.
Leaving? Like leaving? Like not staying?
No. You will be sued for breach of contract because I will no longer be the promoter of your career. I will have to leave you.
Come, Abigail. Go. Abigail.
Fableman is the kindest, smartest, wisest, most patient, most decent, most understanding man there is, and I'm gonna stay married to him.
We'll always be together, won't we, Paul? Yeah. We'll stick together. We'll always be. I can't do this, Paul. I can't do this. I need to go home. I need to go home.
I think we need to go our separate ways.
Are you breaking up with me?
Not at prom, but of course, eventually.
Your mom misses Phoenix too much.
Tell them the truth.
And I can't leave. This is where my work is. I have to.
We stay together. You love each other, and you love us.
You'll be back soon, won't you, Siobhan?
Oh, Pork.
Don't say oh, Pork. Say yes.
I have to go.
Will you please stay?
I have to go. Okay, if I stay, I'll never leave. You have to let me go. You have to let me go.
Just let me go.
So we must decide now to stay and fight or leave. Those are the options in front of us. We will not do nothing.
Ooh, makes me tear up.
Really?
Yeah.
It is a lot of leaving, right? So, you've got fighting, can't figure out what's good, and then a whole lot of leaving. And I was thinking about this leaving thing, and forgive me for this one, but the other day in the news, we had someone who suggested that we should break up and divorce. Margie Taylor Greene said that we should be like divorcing as a country and separating as states. And so I don't think that's the answer, by the way. I'm not promoting that at all. I think that's a little bit crazy, but that was just sort of when I was watching all these characters leaving, I'm like, oh, well, I hope that doesn't happen. I hope this is not what this is foreshadowing. And I don't believe it is. In fact, we're going to kind of go through some of the things of what it could be. But for me, I just felt like, okay, you've got these three things when we're trying to figure out, are we going to be a we? These three themes that seem like it's just like a no. And so I called up a friend of mine. Her name is Shaylyn Romney Garrett. You know her because you've interviewed her too.
She is freaking brilliant.
Yeah, tell them about her.
Yeah, she co-wrote a book called The Upswing.
Oh, I got it right here. Go ahead.
Yeah, she co-wrote that book called The Upswing with Bob Putnam, who also wrote Bowling Alone several decades ago.
Which Bowling Alone is huge. It was like a seminal work that really applies today to the concept of loneliness.
Yeah. So she is now writing a book about the sort of a common positive vision we need for the future. And she's long been someone who really resonated with your idea of will we be a we and what is culture moving towards, a we or a not we.
Yeah, so the whole book really is about the concept of we. So I called her up and I said, Shaylyn, explain the book to folks so they understand this concept of how we have historically been going through an I, we, I curve, which she'll explain. And then we'll also talk to her about what she feels like the state of we is. So this is a deep dive into this book. She does a little bit of a summary of it. So here's Shaylyn. I want folks to hear, like with the Upswing, kind of the hope and the promise that you and Robert Putnam put together as far as just this historical, downswing and upswing of the concept of individualism versus kind of the we concept.
Right.
Can you give that just like in a brief, synopsis? I know you took a whole book to explain it, but
Sure. Yeah. So I was talking earlier about how we're living in this really hyper individualistic moment. And the way that the reason that I can say that is because the data is quite clear. When you take measures of culture, when you take measures of our social fabric or how connected or how much we join and associate with one another, when you take measures of our economics, how equal we are versus unequal a distribution of resources. And also when you look at our politics, how willing we are to cooperate across party lines versus being polarized. When you take all of those measures together, it's clear that we are more polarized, more economically unequal, more socially isolated, and more culturally narcissistic than we have been at almost any other time in our history. That's today. And so the question is, of course, how did we get here? And are there any lessons of history for sort of how we descended into this moment? Are there any other times when we weren't in a moment like this? And so my co-author and I, what we did is we looked at trends over time in all of these four areas of our society over the last 125 years. And what we found was that the moment we're living in today is not the first time that we've been here. We've been in another extremely isolated, narcissistic, unequal, polarized moment. And that was at the turn of the last century in the early 1900s, a time that historians called the Gilded Age. So the last Gilded Age, which happened on the heels of the Industrial Revolution, was a time that looked remarkably similar to the one that we're living in. But what happened in between? That time, just like today, was a time when commentators were saying, it's tyranny and it's plutocracy and it's the end of democracy and the American experiment has failed. And yet none of those doomsday prophecies were fulfilled. On the contrary, the data shows that we entered this multifaceted, multi-decade upswing during which we became more economically equal, less and less polarized, decade upon decade, more and more connected socially and associating with one another, forming families, forming communities, and also less and less narcissistic, more and more focused on what we could do together, more solidaristic in our culture. And so that trend continued almost uninterrupted in all of those areas of our society for almost 70 years, between about 1900 and the mid-1960s.
Yeah.
But then in the mid-1960s, when we reached this peak of we feeling or a we phenomenon in our society, instead of continuing to go upward, which is what John F. Kennedy hoped we would do when he said, ask not what you can do, what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. He was articulating that we ethos.
Yeah.
But what happened instead was we turned in the other direction. And all of those different measures in economics, politics, society, and culture, we took a sharp turn in the direction of I, and we slid downward for over a half century, going right back where we started. So we call this the I century that was really individualistic at the beginning. We moved ourselves into more we direction, and now we've slid back down into more I direction. So the question is, can we create another upswing? Can we get ourselves back in a mode of we, and how would we do that? And so that's what that book is about.
Pretty brilliant stuff, huh? Yeah. So I asked her, I said, okay, here are the themes this year. Like, tell me what you think as far as, the state of we, where we are right now, especially post-COVID. So here's what that sounded like. Where do you feel like we are as far as this concept of we right now after COVID? Like, I feel like we went through an event that was a pretty major event where we did kind of we things. And it felt like I thought, well, this is going to be the tipping point to we, because we all kind of did, some hard things together.
Yeah.
But it doesn't kind of feel that way. Is that kind of your vibe on it all? Like, what do you feel like is the kind of the state of the union of the concept of can we be a we?
I'm really reminded, I was thinking about this yesterday because someone was saying to me, after, during the pandemic, we had the rise of all this kind of mutual aid and people working together and sort of taking care of one another. And as I was listening to this, I thought, right, but where is that now? Has that sustained? And I was reminded of what happened after 9/11. After 9/11, we had this real surge of togetherness, a sense of being in this together. This crisis had sort of turned our hearts toward one another. And all of the studies of that period show that lasted exactly about 6 weeks. And then we started back to normal.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so for a crisis of that magnitude, that was how long the effect was of the crisis itself changing us, right? And so I think there's a real sense that I encounter this a lot when I talk to groups about historical narratives and change over time in whether we're a we or whether we're more isolated and individualistic. And people have this sense that it's outside events that turn us toward one another, that it's something outside of us, some crisis that's going to bring us together, right? And there was this sense that COVID was going to do that.
Yeah.
And what it shows is that there really is a temporary effect of an outside shock bringing us together. But if we don't continue to choose that togetherness over time, what we do is just go back to what we're habituated to, which is all of the isolation and the loneliness and the individualism. And so I think there was a real chance to learn and to really start to change, but I think there was also this scary recognition that the way in which we needed to change was going to require us to do some deep inner work that it seems like most of us aren't ready to do. And so we're defaulting back to where we were before, I think.
So that's her perspective. So, that's, the concept of we and this question of can we be a we. But I want to kind of give us some hope. So, so there's a hope that I felt like happened last year in the Oscars. 9 out of 10 Oscars last year, so 9 out of the 10 Oscars, had change agents in those films that were Gen Z age. So they were next generation change agents last year. I called it hope in the between-agers. So I was like, okay, this year, what's going to happen is, and I'm always wrong when I try to fortune tell. So I'm like, this year what's going to happen is you guys, your generation is going to stop this war in Ukraine, like it's going to be you guys, or it's going to be Russian, youth or something like that, because they usually stop wars and stuff like that. And there's going to be all these things, or if it's not war, it's going to be something else where the next generation helps us be a we. Crickets. I'm still waiting on you,
I'm sure we
dude.
did some things.
You probably
I don't know
did
what they
some
are.
things. So I was like, well, there is a trend this year that keeps going. So even though there were 9 out of 10 last year, this year there are still a whole bunch of next generation characters. So there's 8 out of the 10 this year actually are still younger generation characters. And so I want to kind of, I called up my friend Tim Elmore. Now Tim is a guy who does next generation kind of work. He works with an organization called Growing Leaders. And I asked Tim, I said, tell me, Tim, about this generation. Like, I want to know, like, what, I want to know about my son. I want to know about his age folks. Like, what could make them change agents? Like, what is special about them? And then this is what he said.
As I collect data on Generation Z and the Alpha generation, I'm seeing a younger population feeling very empowered. In fact, when you look at the data, the millennials felt more entitled than Gen Z, but Gen Z feels more empowered. So think about it. The millennials grew up with a cell phone. Gen Z's growing up with a smartphone, which has been a game changer. So they feel empowered because they can ask questions of Google. In fact, I just had a conversation with a dad recently that said to me, I'm not having the same conversations with my teenage kids that I had with my dad when I was a teenager. And I said to him, you can thank Google, Siri, and Alexa for that one. So the dinner time conversations we once enjoyed are often now we're on portable devices and we're not having them. But I think that empowerment happens. And by the way, they can look up the dirt on an older generation and see you don't have the answers. Look at your life. It's falling apart like mine is. Now, I may be overspeaking, but I think they see themselves sometimes better positioned to bring about change than the older generation is. And by the way, when they ask for change, or dare I say demand change, I think we go, okay, we'll tweak that. And they're going, oh, no, not a tweak. I want an overhaul. So when we watched the Black Lives Matters protest a few years back, and we even saw initiatives like defund the police, older folks are going, defund the police, that's stupid. But what they're really saying is, I think the entire institution you set up is not working anymore. So if we defund, right or wrong, we get to start over and maybe do something right. So they're crying out, not just for change, but for transformation.
So you're my token Gen Zer. So what do you feel about that? Especially this idea of not wanting a little bit of change is like really wanting transformation.
Well, as soon as I saw that guy's face, I thought, he's not going to know about Gen Z. And then I heard what he said, and I was like, oh, yeah, I think he knows what he's talking about. So that was cool. Yeah, I definitely resonate with a lot of the stuff that he said there. I think so many of my friends have had this experience of, especially throughout 2020, so many inadequacies of our reality were revealed, things failing and systems that we've set up not working. And as we asked them to change, and we sort of, Shaylyn mentioned that, had sort of opportunities to reshape what our society looks like, felt like everyone was kind of like, can we just get back to normal as soon as possible though? Mm-hmm. And when change did happen, it was like, oh, here's a boulevard named after the cause that you like. And it's like, well, that's not, but what about the cause that I like? I wasn't campaigning for a boulevard. And so I think, yeah, there is a sense of discouragement in that sometimes. Yeah, but also definitely a sense of, because of the internet, a profound power to shape things in some way.
Yeah, so I feel like this brings, like, one of the things I wanted to do this year was kind of combine themes. So one of the themes is just like this Gen Z seeing 8 out of 10, and then that complicated center of good with 8. I feel like your generation is kind of complicated, right? Like, I see you guys wanting to change things and wanting to be change agents and really set to be change agents. And yet, I think one of the things that we talked about was just this idea of the world that you grew up in. Like, you were born in 2000, so 9/11 happened right after that. And it just seems like there's just been chaos ever since in your life. And as far as external chaos, hopefully not internal chaos. Anyway, but I really thought that, the anthem movie for this year, it seems like, and correct me if I'm right or wrong, is Everything Everywhere All at Once. That there's something about that movie that's really resonating with your generation. And the concept of a multiverse, right? There was a lot of movies that were about multiverses, and this is another movie that was about the multiverse, right? And so I asked Tim about the multiverse concept, and then I want to ask you about multiverse, and this is what Tim said.
I do believe Generation Z feels a bit like they live in a multiverse. And my son and daughter even talk about this to me. So the first thing I think it produces is a sense of just being overwhelmed. 94% of university students say today that the number one word they use to describe their life is the word overwhelmed. 94%. 44% say I'm so overwhelmed it's difficult to function. Almost half. And nearly 1 in 10 has thought about suicide in the last year. Now, maybe they didn't pull out a weapon, but it crossed their mind. It might be easier to end it all than to face what I have to face. And part of this is the pluralistic multi-dimensions coming at them all at once.
So why do you think Everything Everywhere All at Once is resonating, that whole concept of a multiverse?
Yeah, I think when I saw Everything Everywhere, it's not even my favorite of these nominees. It's not my favorite of the year, but it was definitely something that I saw and I was like, I see why this is resonating with so many people. And I did a lot of thinking about it and thinking about the multiverse concept in general. Like so many different movies, whether it's Doctor Strange or lots of Marvel stuff, have also touched on the multiverse concept. But Everything Everywhere, I think, if some movies use the multiverse just to be like, hey, there's different Spider-Mans and they can meet each other. Everything Everywhere is like, there's a multiverse and it's horrifying. Like, imagine how overwhelming it would be to know that you were one in an infinite reality of tons of different versions of yourself, all living different lives and possible realities that you could live in. And so the main character in Everything Everywhere All at Once, played by Michelle Yeoh, what's her name? Evelyn, is sort of hurtled through all of these different realities throughout the movie. Realities where she was a movie star, realities where she was a kung fu fighter, realities where she married her husband and where she didn't marry her husband, realities where she made different choices when she was a kid and different choices later.
She had hot dog hands.
A reality where everyone has hot dog fingers. Yeah. A reality where the movie Ratatouille is real, except it's a raccoon and not a rat, and it's called Raccacoonie. It's all these crazy realities. And so it's very funny, but it is also very existentially frightening, especially for her character, because it's like, does any of my life matter in the face of all of this infinite multiverse of choice and, you know, all these different lives that I could have lived? All these universes look better than mine or you know, worse or just insane. Like, and how do I make sense of things? And the first thing that I thought when I saw the movie was, this is the movie, along with maybe Bo Burnham's Inside, which is a Netflix special that I really love. I think this is the movie that captures the experience of what it feels like for Gen Z to be alive in the internet era. In an era where you have things on your social media timeline, funny things like memes, and very serious things like news about pandemics and Ukrainian wars and climate change and all kinds of stuff, and news from your local community and news from the world and updates from your friends that you know in real life and updates from friends you know from across the world, and all kinds of, you know, things from TV shows and movies and things happening in the real world, all of that being hurtled at you all at once. And it is incredibly existentially terrifying, I think. It can be quite empowering because it's like, hey, I can make friends across the planet. I can know what's going on all the time. And I've made tons of friends through the internet and have used it in ways that I'm really proud of and excited about. But it's also really scary because it makes you wonder, what's the significance of my life? What is, you know, what is real and what is, you know, when can we make jokes about things? I remember, I'm trying to think what it was. I think it was when the Ukrainian war was starting. There was also, like, at the same time on Twitter, trending some really funny event that was happening in the US. And so I was seeing both of these, like, this really funny thing happening in the US and the Ukrainian war on my timeline at the same time. And I was like, how do I make sense of this? It felt like looking at two different universes. And I think that also speaks to the way that, you know, with our social media bubbles and even just media bubbles, like news stations and stuff, there can be a sense that we feel like we're living in different universes from other people. Like the universe that some of our parents live in, watching different news stations than we do, feels like a very different universe than ours. It feels like all of the information that you are receiving is completely different information than I am receiving. And then on the internet, you can Google the earth is flat or the earth is not flat and find information to back up either of those positions if you want.
So you don't know what truth is, too.
Yeah, and a community that will support you in that, which can be amazing, right? I've met amazing community, film fans and fellow filmmakers on the internet. But it can also be frightening to know that you could decide whatever you want and find people online who would agree with you on that.
Yeah. That's so good, Houston. Really nicely put. I think as my generation, we don't understand that because we didn't grow up as a digital native, is what they call your generation, right? Like you started with it all. And so I talked to Shaylyn because I felt like there was something that she had to offer from the standpoint of looking at this concept of digital natives in relationship to history when we looked at, she looked at the last time that we started towards the we, what happened. So this is what she said about how our generation, this generation, Gen Z, kind of does mirror a previous generation.
So the upswing and the progressive era specifically was, the activism was really led by young people. And the reason that that was so important and the reason that we feel that young people were so critical was, again, these young people who had lived through, you know, the Industrial Revolution and were living in this entirely changed world from what their parents had experienced. They were really the only ones who could figure out how to move forward in that totally changed context. And how similar is it today, right? Where it's our digital natives, because for as much as we want to criticize social media and for as difficult as it is, you know, the effect that devices are having on us, this stuff isn't going away. It's our new reality. It's getting more intense. Now we have this wave of AI that's coming at us, right? Like it's not going to go away. It's only going to intensify. And it's really going to be our digital natives who are going to have to figure out the way forward. But what they need is the know-how of previous generations.
That's great.
Yeah. I definitely resonated with what she said there because I think I used to view the internet and social media. I'm a YouTuber and I spend a lot of my time on YouTube and making content for the internet. And I used to view it as like a neutral tool that I was like, well, you can just use it for good or bad, and I'll use it for good. And now I go, no, it's rigged for bad. You have to fight uphill to use it for good. But it is worth it because it's an incredibly huge part of the reality that we live in, and it wouldn't make sense to completely ditch it. And I have quite a heart. I don't think everyone needs to have a heart for social media. I think some people getting off social media is great. But for me, I have a huge heart for using those platforms in some way that could be good, even if it means fighting against what they're made to be. And so,
and I think what she's saying is so great as far as giving us hope for your generation being change agents, because you're the only generation that is living in a time, like she said, where, you know, she was talking about the turn of the century where all these kids grew up on the farm with their parents being farmers, and then they went to the city with the Industrial Revolution, and they were the first generation to go into the city and really be a part of this Industrial Revolution. So you're the first generation to go into this, be a digital native, and to lead us forward because you're the generation that has grown up with that, if that makes sense. So,
well, it makes me think of what she said about AI. There have been all these AI-generated images and things online in the past few months, and I've seen it fool a lot of older people who don't have experience. But if you ask someone who's from Gen Z, they go, no, zoom in on that. That person has 20 fingers. That was made by a computer. And so I think there is a sense of like language that we have that is able to aid in that.
That's good. All right, so let's go to the biggest theme for this year. So the one that was in blue at the beginning, this is the one that I really want to camp on because I feel like this is the one that I feel like God is speaking to us about. And so this is, it was in 10 of 10 movies, the idea of relational barriers and boundaries. So that was kind of the big theme that showed up in every single one of the movies was the concept of relational barriers and boundaries. The question that I would imagine most people have is what's the difference between a barrier and a boundary? So I had to do that kind of work for myself to figure out what is good and bad. And again, because this is a complicated year, everything's complicated. None of this is formulaic. But when you think of barriers, you think relational barriers, you usually think bad, right? You think of, okay, she has her wall up, or he has, you know, he just has this barrier that he's built so that no one can penetrate it, you know? So when we think of relationally barriers, usually it's kind of negative, not all the time, but negative. And then when we think of boundaries, we usually think of people setting up healthy boundaries in relationships. So I thought I would parse these out just a little bit so that people can see images of both. So what you're going to see is we're going to start with barriers, just the idea of relational barriers. And here's what that feels like in this montage. And I want to kind of, before it plays, I feel like the thing, I was driving here today and I was telling the guys as we were driving, I said, the thing that I feel like we need to do is watch this montage here and know that these characters represent a ton of people in the world right now, feeling lonely, feeling isolated, feeling like they have barriers between them and other people, that there's healing that hasn't happened yet. And so as you watch these characters, what I want you to do is just really empathize with the fact that these people have barriers between them. So this is what it looks like.
I just don't like you no more.
You do like me.
I don't.
You liked me yesterday.
Oh, did I? Yeah.
Why'd you pull my papers at the academy? Why did you stand in my way?
You weren't ready.
Ready for what? Huh? Ready to fly like you?
No. Ready to forget the book. Trust your instincts. Don't think. Just do. You think up there, you're dead. Believe me.
My dad believed in you. I'm not gonna make the same mistake.
I'm tired. I don't want to hurt anymore, and for some reason, when I'm with you, it just hurts the both of us. So let's just go our separate ways, okay? Just let me go.
This is your fault. Everything that's happening now, just because you ran away from home and took all of us with you.
I came here so I could work 10 times harder with 10 times the responsibility, which seems to have escaped everybody's
Could
notice.
everyone
So
settle?
I
I
could
want
build
to
us
say
a nice
You didn't come
home
here
in
to
a-
build houses. You didn't come here to work. You ran away. I think you have something to say to me, Sammy. And if I'm right about that, then get it off your chest and say it to my face.
I started therapy.
Wow. I love that when he sits down at the end. It just like speaks to emotionally this concept of these walls that are between us, right? So that's barriers. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Relational barriers, which are like walls between people. Boundaries are the things that we want to set up in order to be healthy, right? And so in the movies, when we look at boundaries, I think the two movies that really, I think show this, the first one is kind of a funny picture of the boundaries of, in Triangle of Sadness, you have the upper class who are there on a boat, and then you have the servant class. And the servant class is being taught to not say no. And you see one of the servant class trying to set a boundary and it just doesn't happen. So here's what that looks like.
It's always, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. If it's an illegal substance they want, or a unicorn. Yes, sir, yes, ma'am. Yes. Woo.
I command you, enjoy the moment.
Now.
Please.
No?
No?
No.
What? You say no to me?
No, no.
Oh, so it's yes?
Yeah, no.
Yes or no?
I'm saying... sorry, I'm saying... Yes! Yes!
Yes!
Clearly someone who's trying to set a healthy boundary and just is not able to do it. And unfortunately, a lot of the characters in these films, we want them to set boundaries and they do not set them. And probably the one that I love this movie this year. I don't know how many of you guys have seen Elvis. How many of you guys saw Elvis? Oh, so a good number.
Wow.
Then you probably were like me, where you were just like yelling at the screen going, set a boundary around yourself with this colonel. Like, you knew that the colonel was like using, or, you know, owning and using Elvis to pay his gambling debts and all this kind of stuff. And the song that's so great in the movie is him singing, "You're caught in a trap," you know. And you're like, that was a whole metaphor for Elvis in the movie, where you feel like he doesn't have ownership over his music. He doesn't have ownership over his life. He wants to go to Europe, and constantly the colonel is like pulling him back. In fact, in the movie, they call him the snowman because he always snows him back into relationship with him. And so Elvis is not able to set a boundary. So here's a scene from the movie where Elvis is trying his best to set a boundary with the colonel, and the colonel does what he always does.
I think we need to go our separate ways.
Well, you may be right. Maybe it is time for me to retire.
Oh, come on, Colonel, quit snowing me. You ain't retiring.
I will miss the circus. I will. But I cannot keep up with these young fellas like your Mr. Hewlett, who wants to put in together a new show for an international tour for you to play stadiums. These international tours are very, very expensive. And the costs cut into the artist's profits. I worry that the financial risk would put a strain on your daddy. But I cannot help but think, as your former technical advisor and as an old friend, what if the next Elvis Presley show did not cost you a red cent? I wonder if your daddy would not like the sound of that. The brand new International Hotel.
So that was just one of those scenes where, and of course this is a guy's real life, right? You know, like Elvis lived this, where now he's, you know, goes and is on the Elvis Strip, on the Vegas Strip, and ends up, you know, never being able to go to Europe and do the things he wanted to do. And the whole movie, like I said, you're just screaming, set up a healthy boundary, set up a healthy boundary. So, makes sense?
Yeah, it
Boundaries
hit
and
me
barriers?
that, you know, even All Quiet on the Western Front, which is about World War I, is the boundaries of Europe itself that are being impinged upon by Germany.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, to sum it up, barriers, usually in relationship, bad, right? So creating a barrier is usually bad, but breaking through a barrier in a relationship is usually good, right? Setting up a healthy boundary is usually good, but crossing over a healthy boundary is usually bad. I had to do it for myself. I was like, okay, I have to get this in my brain. So that when I looked at the answers that the Oscars were giving us when it comes to barriers, I thought, okay, so the first answer that is coming out of the Oscars from the standpoint of, you know, like this barriers and boundaries is that we need to actually break through relational barriers to eliminate isolation and heal. So another kind of smaller theme that I would combine with this is a whole lot of these movies have isolation, they have islands, they have a person who's the only one in a sea of whatever, filling in the blank. And so for me, this is I'm so passionate about this. This is where we kind of turn the corner in the show, where it's like I could easily become prescriptive and easily like I probably will end up getting on my soapbox because I feel like this is so important right now. And so this is what I feel like is the first push, is this idea of relational barriers and us breaking through relational barriers.
And why do you think that that is happening right now?
So why now? Okay, so this is me. This is all me. This is not in the movies, right? The reason I think this is so important is that I feel like right now we just went through a moment that was, like Shaylyn said, a really huge crisis with COVID, right? And if you think about it, we set up all of these physical barriers, okay? So we did masks, we did plastic between us, We did, social distancing, obviously. And so we had all these barriers that were physical barriers, right? That we said, good. These are good. These are keeping us healthy. These are loving people by putting up these physical barriers, right? But at the same time, we also knew in our heart of hearts that this was creating relational barriers too, which was bad, right? That it was creating isolation, that it was creating that social distance was not only just physical, but it was emotional and it was relational. And so that dissonance in my mind is pretty huge, right? So
It's
again,
that complicated
it's
center
the
of good.
complicated center of good, right?
Yeah.
So here we are going, I got to do a physical barrier that's good, and yet a relational barrier that feels bad, right? And they're meshed together, okay? So the reason I think this is important is we live through this, and we haven't really processed this yet. And I feel like what we're doing in this moment in time, the reason that I feel like this is such a God moment, and this is why I'm getting so passionate about it, is because if you look back at 2020, I believe God was going, hey, you got to test your devotion and see if you'll be your brother's keeper. And this is what you've got to, this is what we figured out to do with that, right? But now I think God's going, okay, but now, you loved your neighbor by setting up these physical barriers. Now I need you to break through those barriers in order to love your neighbor. I need you to work really hard because there's all sort of these remnants of COVID that are still in the world. I mean, we still have physical remnants of COVID still. When I go to Walmart, I see more self-checkouts than I do people, doing the lines, right? So there's just these remnants of COVID that are still out there. We still have DoorDash. We still have all these things. I call it, what I call this thing is the long-term social COVID effect. The idea that we have this long-term aspect of trying to figure out how to break these relational barriers. Does this make sense at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting passionate. Yeah. So for me, it's just really important for us to figure out how do we do that, right? But it's probably much easier for us not to do it. So I want to throw up a slide here. This is a slide of every reason why we should continue to social distance. So I want to check with the audience here and see how many of you guys feel like it's just easier. Like it's just, like I don't know if you, yeah, exactly. It's just easier, right? For us to continue to kind of not physical social distance, but it may be even physical. Like how many of you guys, when you go to Walmart, you're like, even if the lane with the person is open, you're like, I still am just going to go through the self-checkout. Yeah? All right, thank you for the honesty in the room. Yes. So there's just the ease in which relationally we just feel like it's just easier, not to break through these barriers. How about efficiency? So efficiency, how many of you guys remote work where you're just like, you know what? Easier to jump on Zoom, easier not to have to worry about traffic. It's just more efficient for us to not have to deal with that aspect of life. And what's robbed out of that is us being in community with and breaking through these relational barriers. How many of you guys, it's exhausting? I would say how many introverts are in the room? Yeah, there we go. So when you think about it, you're like, man, I got away during COVID with not having to go to that party, but that has those casseroles that I hate and all that kind of stuff with that person. And for me, that was it. It was like, oh, wow, I got an excuse not to go to this party because I'm an introvert and I'm like, I don't really, you guys felt the same way? It's just kind of exhausted to think of going and doing it again. And then the last piece is, it is hard for us to get back with people because we feel like we might say something stupid, or it's just the embarrassing part of it. So that's kind of what I feel like we're faced with right now as far as reasons why we are relationally with barriers with each other. So that's kind of that concept. Now there also is stats around this too that I'd like to show you though. So here's the stat. There's tons of stats, but these are the ones that really broke my heart. So it says that, is it 60%? I can't read it. What is it, Chris?
60%.
60%.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So 60% of people in the United States report feeling lonely on a regular basis. Okay? So that's what we're dealing with, right now as far as relational barriers. This stat I just put up there because I thought, man, this is huge. 43% of teens say they use their phone to avoid interacting with people. It's not like they're on their phone just kind of doing stuff with people. It's they're using their phone going, okay, I'm going to be on my phone so I don't have to talk to people, you know? Those were like two statistics that was just like, why now? You know, like why, hey, yeah, exactly. Why now? Why do we feel like this is the moment where we need to break through relational barriers? It's because this is the moment, right? Where I do feel like God's like pushing us back into the playground almost, saying, here, go back into the playground, be with people, you know, and break through these relational barriers in which people are truly lonely out there, right? So that's kind of some of that. But I think the solution is what I would say, for me, the solution is proximity and presence. So that's the solution. Like we got to get closer to each other, and we got to be present when we're close and when we're with each other. So to me, this is kind of the solution. I know I feel like I'm preaching now. Oh my gosh. But I feel like this is the solution to our being able to really break through these boundaries, break through these barriers, is learning again to be in proximity with each other and to be present within that proximity. And my example for this, I love this example. This is the one that I felt like I woke up in the middle of the night and I wrote an essay on this, because to me, this was just like the example of this for me as far as proximity and presence.
I woke up the next day and he had sent an email to me at 4 a.m. like,
That's
hey,
right.
read this essay I wrote.
Exactly. And it has to do with a passion that you and I have, which is the concept of Walt Disney World and pin trading. So explain to the folks, what is that whole vibe and that subculture within Walt Disney World?
Yeah, well, we're both huge Walt Disney World fans. And one of the huge fun like niche things to do at Disney World, and also like slightly cheaper things to do, I don't know, it's still kind of expensive. Everything at Disney World is a little bit expensive, but is pin trading. You can buy collectible pins and put them on a lanyard around your neck or on your bag, and they're often of different rides and movies and things. And one of the things that I grew up doing at Walt Disney World was pin trading with cast members. Every single cast member at Walt Disney World would have a lanyard around their neck.
Yeah, so the lanyard is like, well, you got a picture of it? Yeah, that's what it looks like. So that's the lanyard. So the cast member would, you know, pull their lanyard out, let you look at it, and you would trade. And keep going. I interrupted you.
Well, it was always a fun way, especially as a kid, for me to have a reason to go interact with cast members and like a thing to ask them about. And sometimes they would do things like they'd have a pin turned backwards and you had to guess a trivia question to see what the pin was and then trade with them. They would always trade with you whatever you wanted to give them, even if your pin was much less good than theirs. And so that was always a fun thing. You'd get to ask them where they were from and all that kind of stuff. But it was
and
always
their name
something.
tags told you where they were from.
Yeah.
And secret, you may have not known this, but your mom and I, we actually were using this because they were homeschooled. So we were using this as a way to help them know how to talk to adults, right? So we'd go, you got to go up and ask them to see their pins, right? And so they would go up and see their pins, and of course the cast member would show the pins. Well, you can imagine that in COVID, that totally went away, right? Because your proximity is very, like with the cast member. So out of protection, Walt Disney World, took that away. Well, everything in Walt Disney World has come back, pretty much. So character meet and greets where now you can hug Mickey is back, buffets, those things are back. But the one thing that has not come back is the lanyard. So the lanyard is not back. And I am so upset about it because for me, the lanyard is everything from the standpoint of where we are right now. It is like the symbol of everything for me. Because what the lanyard does is it forces that cast member to be in proximity with that guest. Does that make sense? Where now they have to interact. They have to be present too, because at any time that guest can come up and say, can I see your pins? And so that lanyard is that social currency for proximity and presence, right? Maybe the season of the past was the mask, but now the season, I believe, is the lanyard, right? Where we actually are trying to figure out what is the lanyard for each other, where we can be in proximity and presence with each other. And here's the sad thing. I'm going to throw a few cast members underneath the bus. I'm sorry, Disney. I love you guys. I love cast members. But I did go and ask the cast members. I said, hey, are the lanyards coming back this last time I went? And they went, no, we don't really know, but we kind of hope they don't. And I went, what? And they said, yeah, because really, it was sort of a distraction when we were trying to do our work. And it was like you committed Disney heresy in front of me at that point, because I was like, this is why the magic is gone, because what is their work, right? Their work is to create magic in proximity. And if I was in charge of Disney training, I would make everybody wear lanyards, because especially with the younger generation, it would allow them to have to break through barriers and learn how to stretch those muscles that I think we've lost of being social in proximity and presence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm like preaching so bad right now. So that is the concept of barriers. Now, let's look at boundaries. So boundaries is something that is another answer, I believe, that we have. So we have the idea of how we've got to break through barriers. Then there's the idea that we've got to set healthy boundaries for the things that are power or ownership over us, or robbing us of our dignity, agency, and freedom. So when I think of boundaries, I'm thinking of the things like setting up these healthy boundaries so that we have agency, we have freedom, and we have dignity. So I think we do have to say goodbye to some things. I think we do have to leave some things that have ownership and control over us. And so I'm not the old guy in the room. I thought I'd throw Tim and Shaylyn into this question and allow them to talk about boundaries when it came to one specific thing, which I'll let them talk to.
We are creatures of habit and we live in an addictive world. I would think it would be very, very smart for us to say, I want to overcome those addictions. I want the phone to be a wonderful servant, not a horrible master. I heard someone say recently, when our phones had leashes, we were free. Now our phones are free and we have leashes. So what I often say to a mixed generation audience is, what can we do ourselves to put the guardrails up so the addiction goes away? I mentioned the 2-hour rule before. Less than 2 hours on a smart device and social media, I'm far less vulnerable to that addiction. More than 2 hours, I become addicted. I'm now hearing more and more young professionals and college students say, I'm off of Instagram. Nothing against Instagram, but they're going, I'm getting off. Is anybody on it anymore? And what they were implying was, I'm making a decision. I don't like how I feel on that app. I don't like what it does to me. I get FOMO. I get FOMO. By the way, fear of missing out is real. FOMO, fear of messing up, is real. I think young people realize, I know if I mess up, if I make a mistake, not only will it go on my transcript forever, but somebody's going to capture it on their iPhone, post it on YouTube, and I will be watched and gain this reputation for the rest of my life. So there is a weird sort of reality that we're in today. And the sooner we can gain control of our phones, the better.
The weird thing about this is that the data is actually quite clear.
I know,
For as
right?
obsessed with statistics and data as America is, we're also really good at ignoring the data about social media and devices, right? Like,
Yeah.
we want science to tell us what to do in every other area of our lives, except when it comes to that addictive device that we have to give up, right?
Right.
And so this is a really tough one because, again, I think there have been so many calls for so many years for social media to reform itself, for the government to reform social media, to regulate it, or to to somehow keep it from invading our lives in these negative ways. But again, here's the lesson: like, maybe the power to do that just lies within our own hands, right?
Just me.
And if enough of us leave, that's really the only incentive that these platforms are going to have to make significant change. So it's not about framing it negatively, like, oh, these things are evil. It's more about framing it positively and having that vision of what we want our children's childhood to feel like. And then it makes the choices a lot easier, right?
Yeah.
Because you're operating from a sense of positive vision rather than a sense of negative criticism.
I want to make sure I hit that point strong, is when I talk about boundaries, and specifically when we talk about devices, I feel like we've got to remember that those devices were our lifesaver in COVID, right? We got on Zoom because that was the only way we could see each other, right? We got on FaceTime. Young people, who knows what kind of suicide rate there would have been if there wasn't devices, right? But unfortunately, we kind of went into it and we were already before kind of being owned by our devices. And then it got bigger over COVID as a lifesaver. Again, that complicated good and bad. And then we come out of COVID, and now we're all looking at our phones, right? And it's like that statistic said, where the teens are looking at their phone not to even avoid contact, And so for me, I think, I like what Shaylyn said, which is we need a vision for what we're really after, right? And one of the movies is women talking, and it's these women who've been abused, and they finally just decide we're leaving, right? We're leaving this abusive colony. And I feel like what you see in that movie is a vision for we're going to agency. We're going to freedom. We're leaving because we're going to, feel good about ourselves again. We're going to have our ownership of ourself again. And I think that's the vision that I think we need to paint with this. We want Elvis to leave that relationship, set those healthy boundaries, because we want Elvis to go do a tour in Europe and fly away, right? That's what we want. But he's tied and he's owned by, this person. So that's kind of where I don't know. You're a Gen Zer. You're probably going. Am I talking like an old person? Is that?
I mean, well, I think I'm in a similar boat with you. I'm in a similar place of trying to figure out how to use these things wisely. Not necessarily saying completely leave them, but use them in a way that puts a leash on them, like Tim said.
Yeah.
There's a movie called The Mitchells versus the Machines, an animated movie on Netflix a few years ago that I think engages really, really well with this concept. It's about robots taking over the world, but in the midst of that movie, the characters also use technology to help them defeat the robots. And the character is a really passionate artist who uses Photoshop and her phone to make movies and this kind of stuff. And there's that sense of nuance there of how do we use this to increase our relationship with people instead of destroy it.
But I think we are, like the why now aspect of this boundary is because I do believe, and I don't want to make it all about one thing, like it's about our phone or about our devices, but I feel like that's where we are right this minute. Like in this moment, our devices tend to own us in a way that we've never had them own us because we came through COVID and they were lifesavers, if that makes sense. So I do believe it's kind of specific to this moment. Now there's one last answer, which is a real short one. And so this last answer that I feel like comes out of the Oscars is this idea that I call kind of shrinking your we. The idea is that, if we go back from the very beginning, when we were talking at the very beginning about all these fights, the thing that I said back then was, it seems like hours ago, but the thing I said back then was that everything was small. Like it was just these families. It was just a small inner circle, interrelational, personal, kind of we going on, right? It wasn't a bigger we. It was a small we. And so I asked Shaylyn her last thoughts on this concept of we, of whether, well, anyway, I'm going to ask her the question, so I'll let it roll.
What do you think about just the premise that maybe this we is too big that we've been thinking about? Like, even from a United States of America kind of perspective, like when I looked at the movies, I thought, well, maybe the family that we need to concentrate on is not global now. We need to concentrate on our American family. But I'm kind of thinking that maybe the we that we need is just me and a stranger, Like maybe that's the call to we that maybe creates a bigger we, but if all goes well, but ultimately the we just needs to be smaller. Like these Oscars are saying, get your we smaller. Is that maybe like you wrote a book about a trend that's historical, for us to become a we, and can we get that upswing? But is it really about micro we's that lead to a macro we or something like that?
Yeah, I think that that's right. I don't think that it's either or, right? Like either we're going to focus on the we of humanity or we're going to focus on the we of me and my neighbors, right?
Yeah.
But I do actually think the more I've been in this field, the field of trying to think about how we bring people together, trying to think about how we create community, the more I've done that work, the more I've realized that the global we is too abstract, right? It has to start with experiences that we have every day in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our schools with real people with whom we're trying to find real common ground on real issues that we face every single day.
All right, so I think it is a smaller we. Like she said, it's just like me and you as a we, right? And so I'm reading a book, and I'm real passionate about the book. The book is called The Power of Strangers, and I'm telling you, this is transforming my life. Maybe it's just Confessions of an Introvert, but the whole book is about what if we just started talking to strangers? And what if we just got used to talking to strangers more, right? And that simple thing, like he writes a whole book about it, and it's just amazing about how if we put ourselves in other people's spaces. In fact, there's a little excerpt from the book to bring up where it says, many people dread talking to strangers, but when they do, they tend to come away feeling good, happier, less lonely, more optimistic, more empathetic, with a stronger sense of belonging to their communities. It actually makes them feel safer, providing ready affirmation that people around them are well-meaning. So, they actually did, there's so much good stuff in this book, but basically, they did studies where they put people out there and talking to strangers, and most people felt like 20% of the strangers would talk back to them, and it ended up being like 90-something% of the strangers talked back to them, and their conversation went on like 2 to 3 times more than they thought, And if you think about it, just the idea, and stranger, what I mean by that, I know because we have this whole stranger danger kind of nice little rhyme, but in reality, I don't believe there is like as much stranger danger as we think. Like now we need to be like strangers, like people who are different, people who I don't know. Basically, that's what I'm talking about. It's just your neighbor, not your physical neighbor, but just the person that you don't know.
Maybe your physical neighbor.
Maybe your physical neighbor too. But that we have to begin to engage in, talking to people we don't know, And so there's some, so one of the things Shaylyn said that was really good, she said, I feel like the problem that we have right now is we need to break through barriers, but we just don't know how. And so this book was really good for me because I was like, oh, there's some hows in this. Like, there's some wonderful little hows. I'll give you some tips real quick that he does. He says, first thing you should do is if it's really awkward, you should just go ahead and disclaim that and go, I know you're not supposed to talk to strangers, but I just really love your purse or something like that, that kind of thing. And if you can just increase your curiosity and increase your humility and don't worry about embarrassment, like that was the things. Or this is one of my favorites is the breaking the script is what he says. And I've been trying this lately. And what you do is when a person says, so how's it going today? And most of us go fine. What we do instead, what he does is he says, when they say, how are you doing today? You go, well, I'm kind of a 7 on a, 7 out of 10 today, is my day. How about you? And it all of a sudden was creating these conversations where a person had to put a number on their day, right? Just like little things like that were just absolutely amazing. And so anyway, I'm just kind of excited. Maybe it's an introvert. I talked to my wife about this and she's like, what are you talking about? Like she's an extrovert. And then my mom is like the perfect example of this. Like my mom walks around her neighborhood and all she does is just like go, hey, I love this and this. And she is like the epitome of a person who's not as scared, to make, every stranger is a friend kind of thing. But I think it's just really that simple as far as breaking through barriers. And I got one example, or one thing that happened. It happened downstairs in this building. So I was waiting to do, to talk to the guy who was in charge of this building about doing this event. And I was in the waiting room downstairs, right? And so when I was sitting in the waiting room, everybody around me was on their phones, right? You know what it looks like, where everybody's just like there, buried on their phones. You're looking around the waiting room, and everybody's there. And the guy was next to me had his phone and everything. And so I was just tempted. I was just like, okay, well, I can do my email. So let me pull up my email. And all of a sudden, it was like God said, okay, you got to practice what you preach here. You got to, like this is about breaking through barriers this year. So I looked at the guy next to me, and I said, hey, I love your watch, And he goes, oh, yeah, my dad gave me this watch, and then he went into this whole story about how it was very sentimental to him as far as that. And then I said, so what are you doing? What do you do? And he goes, well, I've been a real estate agent since 14. And I'm like, 14? How are you a real? And then we started a conversation about that, right? And then all of a sudden I said, well, the guy who's developing this complex, have you met him yet? His name is Rob Parker. He's a friend of mine, is what I said. And he goes, oh, yeah, I'm getting ready to meet him. Like, he's coming in just in a second. That's who I'm waiting for. And I said, you're kidding me, Rob. I was supposed to text him and tell him I was here and see if, maybe he could meet me. I said, but I decided to not be on my phone. And all of a sudden, Rob comes in the door, and he looks at us talking, and he's like, what's going on here? I'm supposed to meet this guy. Bryan, you're here? Oh, and all of a sudden, we have this not triangle of sadness, but triangle of, connection, right?
Happiness.
Happiness. And I know it sounds so simple, but I hope it is so simple, right? I hope that's what it is. It's just really simple that we just kind of break through these barriers. So that's kind of this year in the Oscars. I wanted to kind of leave you with one imagery. So I was like, let me just leave you with one more montage to make us all feel good. So here is the Breaking Through Barriers montage. I wish I could give more of it because there's more scenes, but here's the montage.
I see you.
Captain Mitchell! Sir.
Thank you for saving my life.
That's what my dad would have done.
So awkward.
I love it. So just a review. Here's our review. So in order to be a we have to break through relational barriers to eliminate isolation and heal. We have to set healthy boundaries for the things that have power and ownership over us and are robbing us of our dignity, agency, and freedom. Did not get to this point, but the idea of we need to enter into the complicated and wrestle through things and talk through things to find the center of good with each other. And then we need to shrink our we. So it's not just like this global we of how do we become a we, but just like how me and the stranger here, how are we going to be a we by the time we exit this lobby of Rome Trilith. So I thought in the spirit of talking to strangers that we would do a Q&A with the audience and talk and see what their questions might be for this. So that's what we're going to do next.